episode 27, titled Banner Grabbing and Fingerprinting, we're going to focus on how service responses can reveal identity without deep interaction, and how to use that identity information responsibly. Pen Test Plus scenarios often include a service response, an error message, or a default page fragment, and then test whether you can infer what you are talking to without overclaiming. Fingerprinting is a recon and enumeration bridge. It helps you turn "a door is open" into "this is likely what's behind the door," which then drives safer prioritization. The danger is that fingerprints can feel authoritative when they are really just clues, and the exam likes to punish candidates who treat a single clue as certainty. A professional approach treats banners and related responses as evidence that must be validated and handled with minimum necessary collection. The goal in this episode is to make fingerprinting feel like disciplined reasoning rather than like trivia about product strings. A banner can be understood as a service greeting that leaks platform details, often unintentionally, when a service responds to an initial connection or request. Some services present identifying information openly as part of normal operation, and others reveal it through small hints that appear in the first exchange. This greeting can include a product family name, an apparent version string, or a phrase that suggests a particular component or configuration. In exam-style questions, the banner is often the only concrete clue you are given, which is why it is important to interpret it carefully and not inflate what it proves. A banner is valuable because it can reduce uncertainty quickly, allowing you to choose next steps that match the likely platform and service type. At the same time, a banner is not a signed statement of truth, and it can be shaped by intermediaries and settings. When you treat the banner as a clue rather than a conclusion, you keep your workflow defensible. When you read a banner or a service response, you should look for 3 categories of information: product name, version hints, and configuration signals. Product name clues tell you what family of software or service you are likely interacting with, which helps you choose appropriate follow-up questions. Version hints can narrow the likely range of known behaviors and potential weaknesses, but they must be treated as hypotheses until corroborated. Configuration signals can appear as mentions of modules, enabled features, or unusual defaults, and those can matter more than version in some cases because configuration often drives real exposure. The exam expects you to extract these signals while staying cautious because overconfident interpretation is a common trap. A professional reader also considers what is missing, because an overly generic or blank response can itself be a clue about hardening or about an intermediary layer. When you build your interpretation around these categories, you are doing structured fingerprinting rather than guessing. Errors and default pages can also reveal useful fingerprints, sometimes more reliably than a formal banner, because they reflect how the service behaves under unexpected conditions. Default pages can expose product families through layout patterns, text phrases, and standard responses that are difficult to eliminate completely. Error messages can reveal internal paths, handler names, or configuration states that point toward a platform even when explicit version strings are suppressed. In Pen Test Plus questions, you may see a prompt describing a generic login page, a redirect loop, or a default error, and the hidden test is whether you can recognize that these are fingerprinting opportunities. The key is to treat these artifacts as observed behavior, not as proof of a specific backend, because intermediaries can still shape them. Default pages also suggest hardening gaps, because exposing defaults often indicates incomplete configuration hygiene. When you can use errors and defaults as fingerprints, you gain useful direction without deep interaction. Fingerprints can be wrong, and the exam expects you to remember why, because that awareness drives cautious next steps. Proxies and load balancers can present a consistent front that masks multiple different backends,
meaning the banner you see might describe the edge layer rather than the application itself. Deception can also exist, either intentionally or through configuration choices that hide, modify, or spoof identifying strings. Even benign changes like custom headers, security middleware, or generic error handling can obscure identity and make a service appear to be something it is not. In addition, shared hosting and layered services can cause mixed signals, where parts of the response reflect one component while the actual application logic lives elsewhere.
The exam sometimes encodes this by giving you a banner that seems clear, but then including a conflicting clue later, testing whether you can adjust rather than cling to your first impression. When you treat fingerprints as probabilistic, you stay flexible and evidence-driven. Validation thinking is what keeps fingerprinting professional, and it starts with confirming identity through multiple consistent clues.
Instead of relying on a single string, you look for corroboration across different response elements, such as consistent naming patterns, consistent behavior, and consistent platform signals.
If multiple clues point in the same direction, your confidence rises, and you can prioritize next actions more effectively. If clues conflict, you lower confidence and treat your conclusion as tentative, choosing safe steps that clarify rather than steps that assume.
Validation also respects constraints, because you do not need to probe deeply or aggressively to gain corroborating evidence. Often, small, low-impact checks and careful observation are enough.
The exam rewards this multi-clue mindset because it produces defensible conclusions and reduces the chance of chasing the wrong path. When you can explain why you trust a fingerprint, you're showing evidence-based reasoning, not memorization. Fingerprinting guides prioritization because identity clues let you focus attention where risk and likelihood are most meaningful, especially under time or safety constraints. If a fingerprint suggests a service type that commonly involves privileged access or management surfaces, that might rise in priority because misconfiguration there can have high impact. If a fingerprint hints at an older or riskier version family, that can raise priority for controlled validation, but only after you confirm the identity with additional evidence. Fingerprinting also helps you avoid wasting time because knowing that a service is likely a particular platform can tell you what kinds of questions are relevant and what kinds are irrelevant. On Pen Test Plus scenarios, prioritization often shows up as choosing which service to enumerate first, and fingerprinting is the bridge that makes that choice rational. The key is to use fingerprints to guide where you look next, not to justify aggressive action. When fingerprints are used as a planning tool, they improve both efficiency and safety.
One of the most common pitfalls is assuming exploitability from a version string alone, because version labels are not proof of vulnerability, and vulnerability is not proof of impact in the described context.
A version string can be wrong, incomplete, or unrelated to the actual vulnerable component, especially when intermediaries exist. Even when the version is correct, the relevant weakness may be mitigated by configuration, segmentation, authentication, or monitoring, meaning the practical risk is different than the headline suggests.
Pen Test Plus questions often punish this overreach by offering an answer that leaps to exploitation based on a version hint, while the correct answer is to validate carefully or to gather more evidence first.
The professional approach is to treat version hints as a hypothesis generator, not as a trigger for immediate proof. When you keep this in mind, you avoid the trap of turning a fingerprint into an assumption. Your next step should always be justified by evidence and constraints, not by excitement. Now walk a scenario where two clues conflict, because this is a realistic and exam-relevant moment. Imagine you see a banner that suggests one product family, but the default page behavior and error patterns resemble another, and both clues seem plausible. The correct response is to choose cautious interpretation, lower your confidence, record both clues, and seek a small additional observation that can clarify which layer you are actually fingerprinting. You might be looking at an edge component that presents one banner while proxying to a different backend that produces the page behavior, which would explain the mismatch without requiring you to declare one clue wrong. In this situation, the worst choice is to act as if the identity is confirmed and move straight to high-impact actions, because that escalates risk based on uncertainty. The best choice is to keep your language probabilistic and continue with low-risk validation steps that increase confidence. This is exactly the kind of reasoning the exam is measuring when it provides mixed hints.
Quick wins in fingerprinting come from capturing minimal evidence and avoiding unnecessary probing, because the goal is identification and prioritization, not deep interaction. Minimal evidence means noting the key identifying features that support your inference, such as a product family hint and a configuration indicator, without collecting full content that could include sensitive information. Avoiding unnecessary probing means staying within the smallest set of interactions needed to increase confidence, especially in production or monitored environments. This approach reduces operational risk and reduces the chance of creating noisy artifacts that distract stakeholders or trigger alerts unnecessarily. It also makes reporting cleaner because you can reference what you observed without drowning the report in irrelevant detail. On Pen Test Plus questions, the best answer often reflects this restraint, choosing low-impact steps that preserve stability while still improving understanding. When you can achieve clarity with minimal interaction, you are behaving like a professional. Fingerprints support reporting by helping you describe exposure and remediation direction in a way that is actionable without being sensational. Exposure description benefits from being able to state what service type appears present and what makes you believe that, because that helps the client understand what surface exists and why it matters. Remediation direction benefits because knowing the likely service family can suggest what configuration hardening or update hygiene practices should be applied, even if you do not state a specific vulnerability. Fingerprints also help stakeholders prioritize because they connect a host or port to a recognizable service category, making it easier to route remediation to the right owner team. The report should still separate confirmed observations from inferred identity, because inference can be wrong, and clarity requires honesty. In exam contexts, reporting maturity often shows up as careful phrasing and evidence discipline, not as a long list of technical strings. When you use fingerprints responsibly in reporting, you increase utility without increasing risk.
Safe next actions deepen understanding without increasing risk by focusing on controlled confirmation rather than aggressive escalation. The goal is to increase confidence in service identity, understand authentication boundaries, and identify whether the exposed surface is intended, all while staying inside scope and safety constraints. Safe next actions also include documenting what you observed and noting uncertainty, because that supports later decisions and prevents overconfident claims. If the service appears to be a management interface or an authentication point, safe next actions typically involve understanding what kind of access is required and whether exposure is appropriate for the context described. If the environment is sensitive, safe actions might include pausing and escalating when unexpected exposure is discovered, because stakeholder awareness is part of safety. The exam tends to reward these controlled next steps because they demonstrate discipline. When you choose safe next actions, you show that fingerprinting is guiding your workflow rather than driving reckless behavior. A memory anchor can keep the process structured, and a good one is greet, infer, verify, prioritize, record. Greet reminds you that a banner or response is a greeting that may contain identifying clues. Infer reminds you to form a hypothesis about service identity based on observed signals, not on assumptions. Verify reminds you to seek multiple consistent clues and to lower confidence when signals conflict. Prioritize reminds you to use identity clues to focus on higher-risk surfaces first, especially management and authentication points, without assuming exploitability. Record reminds you to document what was observed and what was inferred, preserving evidence and uncertainty clearly for reporting and next steps. This anchor is short enough to use during exam questions, and it maps directly to disciplined reasoning. If you can run it mentally, you'll avoid the most common fingerprinting mistakes. In this episode, the key is fingerprint discipline. Banners, errors, and default pages can reveal service identity clues. But those clues are probabilistic and must be validated through multiple consistent signals. Fingerprints can be wrong due to proxies, load balancers, shared hosting, or deception. So overconfidence is a common trap, especially when a version string appears to make the story easy. Use fingerprinting to guide prioritization, focusing attention on high-value surfaces while avoiding the mistake of assuming exploitability from identity hints alone. Capture minimal evidence. Keep probing low impact. And use careful language in reporting that separates confirmed observations from inferred identity. Now practice with one hypothetical banner by stating what it suggests, what second clue you would seek to confirm it, and what low-risk next step you would take, because that rehearsal turns fingerprinting into a calm, structured habit. When the habit is structured, PenTest Plus fingerprinting questions become straightforward evidence interpretation instead of guesswork. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.